Greetings, APE students. Mrs. Francis here. Today I'm going to be bringing you a little bit about population ecology. So let's get ourselves started. I do have a note-taking guide for you. You can either print it and write on it. That's what I'm going to do here to keep us on good pace. Or you can actually make a copy and write your notes right into the digital document. So we're going to start off first with a little bit of history. How did population ecology even come about? So this guy pictured to the left here, this is a gentleman known by the name of Thomas Malthus. And he was basically an English clerk, and he lived around the time of the 1700s, and he wrote an essay on the principles of population dynamics. And he was the first guy to kind of come up with this. And he had been thinking a little bit about what would happen if we had an expanding population. So he did some theorizing about populations that were growing, what would happen to the resources. And he thought a lot about the competition that was going to be occurring. And he called this the struggle for existence. So his struggle for existence was sort of the driver for actually Darwin's ideas on natural selection. And this inspired a well-known idea of survival of the fittest, meaning the organisms who fit in the environment the best. And so Thomas Malthus not only kind of spurred on population ecology, he encouraged Darwin to do a little deep thinking about which organisms survive. So I typed up these three ideas right here. We've been talking a lot about biodiversity, and that genetic diversity is a huge component of biodiversity. And genetic diversity comes about by having a variety of alleles. And those alleles will then code for various phenotypes or physical characteristics, seen and unseen. And these are the adaptations upon which natural selection is going to act. And so these ideas are all interlinked. Now, when natural selection acts upon a group of individuals, upon a population, we can change the size of that population. So I think it is important that we do get a good working definition of population. And so a population is a set of interbreeding. I'm going to underline that. Organisms who live in the same place at the same time and who compete for resources. When we're saying resources, we're talking about food, space, water, mates, etc. Okay, so they have to be interbreeding. They have to live in the same place at the same time. This is what makes a group of organisms a population. Okay, all right, so what are the characteristics? Like, what are the different ways that we can describe population? So there are typically we say about 8 different characteristics that we can look at. Number one is the geographic distribution. Where exactly are the organisms living? Okay, and we're going to look at a grizzly bear article later today, and you're going to see the geographic distribution what we will call like the bare ecosystem. And so that's one way we can describe the population. We can look at the density. How tightly packed are those organisms into a certain space? We can look at the growth rate. This is something that you're going to need to be able to calculate. And then 4 and 5 go together. This is the birth rate and the death rate. And we will use B and D to represent those in an equation later. All right, the next two go together, 6 and 7, immigration. So that's I, and emigration. You probably recognize these from some of your social studies classes. And then the last thing, which we are not going to spend a lot of time on right now, but we will as we talk about humans, is the age structure. And that is how many individuals are a certain age that are alive at a certain time. And we can actually use it to predict population changes. I'll use the little triangle or the delta there. Okay, so let's look at population growth. So the definition of this is the change in size of a population over time. And we're going to use an equation to calculate this. You do need to know this equation by heart. So population growth equation, you're going to take all of the processes that are going to add individuals, and you're going to subtract any processes that subtract individuals. So the equation becomes births plus immigration. So these two things would add individuals to a population, birth and immigration. And you subtract out the deaths and individuals who emigrate or leave the area. And this gives us the population growth rate. So simple equation, you just got to keep which parts are the adding parts and the subtracting parts separate from each other. All right, let's keep going. So organisms have this struggle for existence. I'm just going to say orgs. That's my organisms. Let me focus that in again. They've got this struggle for existence. And part of that struggle is passing down their alleles. And that's their alleles to the next generation. And so what we have found and what we have observed is that organisms take on two different approaches. So we're going to describe the two extremes in their strategy. So these are we're going to look at like the most extreme end and the other extreme end. Now, these are strategies in order to exist and pass down alleles, and these greatly affect the population size and how those organisms maintain their population. Now, although we're going to describe the two extremes, you need to understand that there's really a spectrum. And so some organisms are going to lean more towards the K strategy, and some are going to lean more towards the R strategy. Okay? So let's start off with saying what the biotic potential is. This is going to be the size of a population under optimum conditions, like really optimum conditions. No predators, excess food, no disease. I mean, this is like all individuals leave. So the death doesn't really happen and births keep happening, biotic potential is never reached. But that is really the goal in these reproductive strategies, to reach their biotic potential. So let's start to look at the two strategies. So we're going to start with the first one, which is called the R strategy. And I've got an A next to here because you're going to see that there's a graph on the next page and it's labeled A. So what are the characteristics of R strategy organisms? Well, first of all, when we say what are the strategies, so let's look at the R strategies and the characteristics that they have. Let's figure out how we can recognize those. So first of all, the R stands for rapid reproduction. Okay, the organisms, and again, I'm just going to say orgs, are smaller in size. They have a short lifespan. So already with my pictures here, we're pointing towards this one right here. They are what we call precocial, and that means that they mature rapidly and early, so earlier on in their life. Okay. An interesting thing is that there is very minimal energy that's put into care or, oops, it should be an R, or production or protection, I'm sorry, of offspring. So they're sort of like, you're on your own. Not much energy is spent by the parents or the parent generation to care for the offspring. In fact, part of the reason is they have many offspring. Okay, and it's usually in one event. So this is like thousands of offspring sometimes, or a large number, depending upon the organism. They may only reproduce one time in their life. Now, this is not true of every R strategist, but they tend to only reproduce one time in life. Some organisms then die immediately after they reproduce. They have adapted to basically unstable environments. And we're going to call this density independent. In other words, survival is not dependent upon how big or small the population is. We'll get more into that later. They are often the prey. They are regulated by outside factors. Things like storms. They tend to be lower on the trophic level. I should say levels. They tend to be pioneers or colonizers or even invasive species. They are niche generalists. And again, this is the extreme. So not every single thing is going to be true of every single R strategist, or there might be some organisms that are tending more towards like the far end, the extreme end, and then there'll be organisms in between. All right. We can also say that they tend to live in low quality environments. The competition for resources is actually low. And some examples are mice, annual plants, flower beetles, bacteria. I usually think of bacteria or mice. Now, if we drew a generalized curve for an R strategist, here's the population size. We've got time happening over here. We tend to see what we call a J curve. You can also see a boom and bust, like mayflies would have a boom and bust, where shoom, and then all of a sudden it drops really fast. But we typically say a J curve for the R strategist. Okay, so let's get on to our K strategists. Yeah, so J curve, R strategists, and then we'll look at the type of curve for the K strategists. All right, so what does K stand for? K actually stands for carrying capacity. And the type of growth is actually called logistic growth. Okay, so you're going to see a lot of opposites here. The organisms are larger in size. They have a long lifespan or life expectancy. They are altricial, which means they mature slowly. And they have sort of what we call an extended youth. And a lot of organisms have a lot of parental care. This is why humans fit in well with K strategy. Okay, they expend significant energy on their offspring. And they do things like protect, they provide food, they are really investing a lot in order to keep those offspring alive. Whereas with our R strategists, they have so many offspring that they know that they're going to lose a whole bunch of them, and hopefully just a few will survive to pass on those alleles. All right, so many offspring for the R strategist. For the K, I would say fewer offspring per reproductive event. So one individual, maybe a litter, a small litter, okay, but tends to be much smaller compared to our R strategists. They can reproduce more than one time per lifetime. Okay, they've adapted to really stable environments. Now, these guys are really affected by density. So these are density dependent organisms. They're affected by things like competition and predation, and we'll get more into that. All right, they are often the predators. They're regulated by internal factors. Higher up on the trophic levels. And we say that if we're talking about plants, we would say that they are later in the stages of succession. So you're talking maybe about like hardwood trees. Okay, from there, let's go here. Oh, niche specialists. And again, this is the extreme. They tend to live in higher quality environments. And the competition for resources is very high. Okay, so examples. Humans, trees, although I've seen sometimes where folks put trees here, so maybe that's not my best example. Salmon, albatross. Okay. The K strategists also can be devastated by invasive species. That might be a note you want to make. Now, the graph looks quite different. So this is the population, and this is time, just like we saw over here. And I like to say that we see more of an S curve. Whoa. An S curve, and you should see a plateau. Okay? So it's going to go like this. It looks at first like it's going to be like this J, but then it reaches a point where it cannot sustain anymore based upon, it can't sustain the growth anymore based upon the number of resources. So it's resource limited, just competition's high. And we get what we call here K, the carrying capacity. So the plateau is where that carrying capacity is. Let's look a little bit more at that. So on the next page, I have a graph that shows both the R strategy, that's this right here, and our K strategy. And so you can see this has sort of that S curve. And this is the carrying capacity, wherever that plateau is. Okay. And again, with that R, you can get a boom and bust where it comes back down. So when we look specifically at logistic growth for the K strategists, one thing I think it's really important is when we draw these graphs, they're very overgeneralized. And I like these two graphs here because it's showing two different populations. And you can actually see that you'll see kind of this up and down, up and down, up and down. And the plateau is like right down the middle of that. Okay. And so like this population is just over 600 individuals. This population's carrying capacity, they probably have more resources, maybe less competition, and this is somewhere around 1,300 in terms of population size. So if the resources are decreased, you're going to see the carrying capacity actually change. Okay, so we talk about an overshoot, and so the overshoot is above the average there. And so when the population, so I think this is an important note to make, is above the carrying capacity, I'll use K for that, it will lead to resource depletion. And if it's severe, this can actually lead to things like famine, disease, and conflict due to competition. All right, so let's look at the factors that affect population size. So first of all, I'm just always going to keep in my mind, this is a lot about resources. So the first one is called density dependent. And density dependent factors actually are going to limit population, okay, especially when it is large. So the larger, the more dense the population, the more this is going to play in. So let me give you some ideas on here. Things like competition for resources, predation, parasitism, and crowding. Okay. Again, we mentioned the types of resources earlier on, things like food, space, mates, the ability to get sun. All of those things are things that we're going to have in the competition. Okay. All right. The second type is density independent. Independent. And these limit population at all sizes. And so these are like more like natural disasters. Weather events, seasonal cycles, and then human activity. Okay, let's get to our last page. Thanks for hanging in there with me. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is survivorship curves. And so there are 3 types of survivorship curves. And I like this graph here a lot. So this has like young individuals, mid-age, and then old. And then this is the number of individuals. So the first type, type 1, you're going to see that there's a low death rate. There's high survival, early, and midlife. So you see that's why it's high up here. Okay, examples, humans fit this very well, and salmon are actually a good example for this. Okay, these are both tend towards K strategy. Okay, I'm then going to go to type 3 because it's sort of the opposite there. So in type 3, we have a high death rate that's early on. Okay, I can't help but think of like going to Metro Park and having all those mayflies. Oh, have you had to experience the mayflies? It's just like this huge population boom, and then millions, it feels like millions of them dying around you. So survival is low at the early stages. So some examples might be like insects, like roaches, frogs, sea urchins. There's a lot of different examples. Now this is here, so hey, when they're young, a lot of them die, and only a few of them make them to that old stage. So this tends to be our R strategist with the type 3. And then type 2 is kind of it's like moderate. So a moderate death rate. Okay, survival is fairly constant. And we're talking about things like corals, songbirds. Okay, and these are somewhere between in the R and K. I kind of lean more towards the K here. And so this is the 3 types of survivorship curves, and those relate right back to our different strategies, our R strategy and our K strategy for keeping the species alive. If we backpedal here, whoop, that's not the one we did. We did this one right here. If we backpedal, we can see the characteristics that tend to be for R strategists versus K strategists. And if we look back here, we've got different ways to describe those populations, and we've got a nice equation here to describe population growth. All right, folks, thanks for joining me today. I hope that you got a good introduction to population ecology. Take care.